There are animals that grieve, animals that remember, animals that watch you from across a field with eyes that hold something deeper than instinct. Most people never stop long enough to notice. They see the behavior and they label it stress, fear, bad temperament, a problem to be managed. They do not ask what is being said, because asking would require a kind of stillness most of us have forgotten how to hold. This is a story about one woman who learned that stillness the hard way. Not because she was wise, but because she was tired enough to stop moving, and in that stopping, finally heard what had been trying to reach her all along. The town of Harlan's Crossing sat at the bottom of a valley so green it almost looked painted. 300 people lived there, give or take, most of them farmers or the children of farmers, people who understood land the way other people understand language, through long familiarity, through the particular grammar of seasons and soil and animals that depend on you. The town had one main road, one post office, one diner that served the same breakfast it had served for 30 years, and a quality of light in the late afternoons that made everything look like it was already becoming a memory. Most people who grew up there either left early or never left at all. Margaret Calloway had never left. She was 61 years old when the horse arrived. She had lived in the same light farmhouse for most of those years, set back from the road at the end of a gravel lane, with a stable behind it and a pasture that sloped gently toward a stand of old oak trees. She had raised her children there, buried her parents in the churchyard 2 miles east, watched the neighbors change and the road get paved and the old hardware store become something else entirely. She had watched Daniel age beside her, which was different from watching change, because aging done beside someone you love doesn't feel like loss until suddenly it is. Daniel Calloway had died on a Wednesday morning in February, 2 years before the horse arrived. He had gone quietly, the way his whole life had been quiet, without drama or announcement, with a gentleness that even his dying somehow maintained. He was there at breakfast, and then he was not, and the distance between those two moments was so small and so absolute that Margaret had trouble for a long time locating where the world had changed. It felt less like a door closing than like a light going out. Same room, same furniture, just darker. She had kept the stable running because she didn't know how else to fill her mornings. 3 horses at that point, an old gray gelding named Philip who had been on the property so long he felt like furniture, a young chestnut mare her son had left behind when he moved, and a gentle part-draft horse named Bess who mostly stood in the pasture and supervised the other 2 with placid authority. The stable gave Margaret a reason to be up before the sun. A reason to pull on her boots and go out into the cold and do the work that horses require, which is simple and repetitive and asks nothing from you except that you show up. She had found, in those 2 years, that showing up was both the hardest and the most necessary thing. She wasn't looking for another horse. She had not been looking for anything, really, which is sometimes the condition you need to be in for the right thing to find you. Her neighbor Pete Harden farmed 3 valleys over, a wide-faced, decent man who had overextended himself in a good year and found himself short on resources in a bad one. He called Margaret on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice carrying that particular combination of apology and practicality that farmers use when they need a favor but don't want to make it sound like one. He had a horse he needed to place, just through the winter. A bay mare, well-behaved. No trouble, he said. Margaret said she would think about it. She thought about it for 4 minutes, standing at the kitchen window watching the pasture go golden in the afternoon light, and then she called him back and said fine. She told herself it was practical. She told herself she had the room. She didn't let herself think about the real reason, which was that the stable had felt too quiet since Daniel, and she had gotten used to quiet being a warning sign, a symptom of something she didn't know how to name. The horse arrived on a gray Thursday morning in the back of Pete's old trailer, the kind with the rusted hinges and the ramp that stuck halfway. Margaret stood at the gate with her coffee and watched Pete coax the animal out. The mare was dark bay, almost brown in the flat morning light, with a white stripe down her nose and ears that turned in every direction at once, reading the air the way an antenna reads frequency. She came down the ramp carefully, placing each hoof with attention, and stood in the yard with her head slightly raised, absorbing. Pete had called her Rue. Margaret didn't love the name but didn't change it either. That had always been her way with things that arrived already formed. Accept them as they come. Learn them slowly. Rue walked into the stable with her head low and her eyes moving steadily, taking in information without reacting to it. She took the stall at the far end without being directed, as if she had already decided. Margaret filled her water bucket and scattered fresh hay and said the usual quiet things a person says to a new animal. Low words, no particular meaning, just the sound of a calm human voice establishing itself as something safe. Rue watched her. Didn't flinch, didn't push forward, didn't seek contact. Just watched, with that quality of attention that certain animals have, the kind that makes you feel considered rather than merely observed. The kicking started 3 days later. Early morning, before full light. A dull rhythmic thud from the stable, hollow and deliberate. Margaret pulled on her coat and went out with a flashlight. The other horses were calm. Rue was standing at the back of her stall, ears forward, posture easy, and as Margaret came closer the mare turned and looked at her and then turned away again, entirely unbothered. Nothing obvious. No injury, no distress. Margaret spread fresh bedding, checked the water, and went back inside. She assumed adjustment. New place, new smells. Animals needed time. She gave it time. The kicking continued. By the end of the first week it had settled into a pattern harder to dismiss. Not frantic, not desperate, not the explosive noise of a horse in genuine distress. Just regular. Methodical. One section of the back wall, always the same section, early in the morning and again in the early evening. 2 windows of activity, reliable as a schedule. Between them, silence, and an animal that appeared, by every other measure, perfectly content. Her neighbor Carl Briggs came by on a Saturday, stood in the stable yard, listened for a moment, and shook his head. Some horses just are, he said. Bad nerves or bad temperament, one of the two. If it didn't stop, she should think about sending it back. Margaret thanked him the way she had learned to thank people for opinions she didn't intend to follow, which is politely and briefly, and then changed the subject. Carl went home satisfied. Margaret went back to the stable. She tried the things you try. She moved Rue to a different stall. The kicking relocated with her, same position, same height from the ground. She called Dr. Sylvie Cross, the vet from Marvel, who examined the mare and found nothing wrong. Heart clean, weight good, eyes clear. No pain response, no back tension. Healthy animal, Sylvie said. Sometimes they get locked into behaviors. Try enrichment. More turnout. A mineral block. Margaret tried all of it. The kicking continued. What shifted, somewhere in the 3rd week, was Margaret's interpretation. She had been treating it as a problem. But problems are irregular. They wax and wane with mood and circumstance. This was not irregular. This was the most regular thing she had observed in a long time. The precision of it was what finally stopped her from filing it away as noise. Always the same wall. Always the same section. Always the same 2 times of day. She had started marking the location with chalk, a small circle on the lower left panel, 3 boards in from the corner, roughly 2 feet up from the floor. Every time, without variation, the hoof marks landed inside that circle. Not near it. Inside it, the way a dart lands in a bullseye thrown by someone who has been practicing with clear intention. You do not hit the same square foot of wood twice a day for 3 weeks by accident. She started sitting with it, not trying to stop it, not trying to redirect or resolve. Just sitting on an overturned feed bucket in the evenings, in the warm dimness of the stable, watching. The other horses shifted and breathed around her. The smell of hay and animal warmth settled like something familiar. And Rue would stand calm and still, and at a certain point she would walk to the wall and do what she had been doing, and then she would turn and look at Margaret, and the looking had a quality Margaret was becoming unable to dismiss as anything other than intentional. She thought about Daniel while she sat there. He had loved the evenings out here more than any other part of the day. He used to bring a cup of tea and sit exactly where she was sitting now and say nothing for long stretches, just being with the animals, just existing in company that didn't require anything complicated. He used to say that barns were the most honest places in the world. No pretending. Everything is what it is. She had thought she understood what he meant. Sitting there in the October dark, watching Rue's patient communication, she was beginning to think she had only been at the very beginning of understanding. On a Thursday evening, 4 weeks after the mare arrived, Margaret brought a lantern into the stable after supper and sat on her bucket and decided not to leave until she had actually paid attention. Not observed from a position of certainty. Just watched. The way you watch when you have accepted that you might be wrong about what something means. The stable was quiet except for the breathing of animals and the occasional shift of weight in a stall. Philip slept in his corner, one hip dropped, eyes soft. Bess chewed hay with placid dedication. Rue stood at the back of her stall and looked at Margaret with those large, dark, unhurried eyes, and the silence between them had a texture to it. A weight. The particular weight of something that has been trying to be said for a long time and is now deciding whether to try one more time. At 7:20, Rue moved. She didn't startle. She didn't build toward it with visible agitation. She simply turned from the back of the stall, walked to the side wall, and struck it. Once. Clean and deliberate. The sound was crisp in the quiet stable. Then she stepped back and turned her head and looked directly at Margaret. Margaret sat very still. Then Rue struck the wall again. Not frantically. Not with the urgency of a panicking animal. She did it the way you knock on a door when you have been waiting a long time and have finally decided to stop being patient about it. 3 measured strikes. A pause. 2 more. And then she turned fully and looked at Margaret, and the look was so direct, so focused, so entirely unlike the vague scanning of a distracted horse, that Margaret felt something move in her chest she couldn't have named in that moment. Something between recognition and shame. She stood up. She brought the lantern close to the wall. She had passed this section of the stable hundreds of times in the past month. She had brushed horses beside it, moved equipment against it, walked past it every single morning and evening without giving it more than the attention you give to the background of a life. She pressed her palm flat against the boards. She knocked with her knuckle, the way you knock on the wall when you're looking for what's behind it. Something knocked back. Not loud. Not sudden. A small, weak, irregular tapping from the other side of the wood. The sound of something very small and very tired trying to make itself known. Margaret stood without moving for a long moment. The lantern threw her shadow long and wavering across the stall floor. Rue was standing directly behind her now, completely still. Not pressing, not demanding. Just present. Just bearing witness to the moment she had been engineering for 4 weeks with a patience that put most humans to shame. Margaret went to the tool shed and got the crowbar. It took her the better part of 20 minutes to work through the boards. Her hands were not as strong as they used to be and the nails had rusted into their holes over what must have been decades. The work required a combination of force and care that she had to find without instruction. Rue stood behind her the entire time. She didn't back away from the noise. She didn't startle at the sound of wood beginning to give. She simply waited, in the way she had been waiting and asking and waiting again, with the enormous patient faith that this time would be different. The first board came free with a sound like a long breath finally let out. The smell came through the gap immediately. Damp and still, the smell of a small space that had not had air moving through it in a long time. Not rotten, just sealed. Margaret widened the gap and shone the lantern through and looked. Between the outer wall of the stable and the inner lining panel, in a cavity no more than 18 inches wide, a space that had probably been a construction gap, a measurement someone got wrong a long time ago and never corrected, there was a nest. Built from hay pulled from somewhere close. Strips of old horse blanket, deteriorated at the edges into long soft threads. A small warm hollow at the center, shaped to something specific. And in the hollow, 2 kittens. 6 weeks old, perhaps 7. One was orange, almost red, with white patches on its feet. The other was a deep and even gray like river stone. They were thin, not skeletal, but thin in the way that things get when they have been living on the last of something and the last of it is almost gone. They blinked against the lantern light with the slow, dazed blinks of animals who had spent a long time in the dark. Their mother was nowhere. Whether she had found a way out and not returned, or whether something else had happened to her, Margaret would never know for certain. She sat down on the stable floor. She sat there for a long time, the lantern beside her, the gap in the wall open in front of her, the kittens in their careful nest blinking slowly in the sudden light. She was not a woman who cried easily or often. She had gotten through the first year after Daniel largely without it, moving through a controlled numbness she had justified to herself as practicality and now suspected had been something else entirely. But sitting on that stable floor in October, looking at 2 small animals who had been in the dark for what might have been days, who had survived because of the persistence of a horse that no one had wanted and most people had written off as trouble, she felt something unlock in her that she had not known was locked. She became aware that Rue was standing directly behind her. The mare had come to the front of her stall, her long head lowered, her warm breath moving across the back of Margaret's neck in the slow rhythm of an animal at rest. Margaret reached back without thinking and put her hand against the mare's nose. The horse held perfectly still under her touch, and neither of them moved for a moment that felt, in retrospect, like the hinge on which the rest of the winter turned. She brought the kittens inside wrapped in her coat and found, in the back of the pantry, an old bottle of kitten supplement she had bought years ago when a barn cat had rejected a litter. She fed them with a syringe, slowly, a little at a time. They were weak enough that they didn't fight it, just accepted the warmth of the milk with a surrendered trust that was almost unbearable to witness. She sat at the kitchen table under the single overhead light and fed them in turns, and outside the window the October dark pressed against the glass, and the stable was quiet for the first time in 4 weeks. She named them that night without deciding to. The orange one she called Ember. The gray one she called Ash. She said the names aloud to see how they felt, and they felt right in the way that right things feel, not with a flourish or a revelation, but simply as if they had been there waiting and she had only just arrived to collect them. She went back out to the stable before she went to bed. Rue was settled and calm. Margaret filled the mare's hay net and checked her water and stood at the stall door with her hand on the wood. The mare turned her head and regarded her, those dark eyes catching the thin sliver of moonlight from the high stable window, and the look was not triumphant or relieved or anything Margaret might have expected. It was simply present. Complete. The look of something that has done what it came to do and is now at rest. Margaret didn't say thank you out loud. She wasn't sure she had the right words for it. She just stood in the quiet stable and let herself feel what she felt, which was a complicated layering of things. Gratitude, yes. But also something that felt like chastening. A recognition that she had been in the presence of something clear for 4 weeks and had been too certain of her own understanding to hear it. And beneath all of that, quieter than everything else, something that felt almost like hope. Not the loud kind. just the small and careful kind. The kind that survives a hard winter and comes back in spring without making a fuss about it. The kittens grew steadily. They were resilient in the way the very young sometimes are, as if survival, once decided upon, becomes simply a matter of logistics. By the end of the first week they were louder and demanding. By the end of the second they had figured out a shallow dish. By the third they were climbing out of the box with a determination that required Margaret to improvise a higher barrier, which they breached by the following morning. She found herself laughing at them. Small, involuntary laughs, the kind that catch in the throat before you've decided to let them out. She hadn't laughed much in the past 2 years, not the helpless kind, not the kind that comes from something actually catching you off guard. Ember would launch himself and Ash from the arm of the kitchen chair with confidence entirely disproportionate to his size, and they would roll across the floor in a ball of orange and gray, and Margaret would feel something in the vicinity of her ribs do something she had almost forgotten ribs could do. If you're still here, still listening in the quiet, maybe you've needed a story like this too. You can like the video, or simply stay a little longer. We're glad you're here. She told the story to her daughter Clara in December, when Clara drove up from the city with her husband Tom and their 2 boys and filled the house with the particular loving noise of a family that doesn't visit often enough and compensates by being fully present when it does. They had dinner at the big kitchen table, the one that had felt too large for one person for 2 years, and it felt the right size again that night. Margaret told the story after dinner, quietly, without embellishment, just the sequence of events laid plainly. Clara listened with her head tilted the way she had listened since she was a small girl, with her whole body oriented toward the speaker. When Margaret finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was one of the most extraordinary things she had ever heard. Margaret said she wasn't sure it was extraordinary. She said it felt more like something ordinary that she had nearly missed. Clara said that was the most extraordinary part. Marcus, who was 6 and had the gravity of a child who takes everything seriously, had followed Margaret out to the stable after dinner without being asked, simply appearing beside her as she pulled on her coat, as if it were a thing that had been arranged. He stood at Rue's stall with his chin resting on the door and his eyes very wide and watched the horse for a long time without saying anything, which was unusual for Marcus, who generally had a great deal to say about most things. Finally he asked, in the careful voice of someone approaching something important, did she know they were in there the whole time? Margaret thought about it. She said she believed so, yes. Marcus looked at the horse and then at his grandmother and then at the horse again. He said, "She's really smart." Margaret said she was. He nodded slowly, the nod of a child integrating something new into how the world works, a model that was apparently large enough to accommodate this without significant revision. Then he took Margaret's hand, the way small children do with a naturalness that adults spend years trying to recover, and they stood together in the warm dim light while Rue moved from her hay net to her water bucket and back, unhurried and at home. The moment had a quality Margaret would return to often in the years that followed. Not as the memory of something grand, but as the memory of something right. The right people in the right place at the right hour. The stable warm around them. A horse who had refused to give up standing quietly on the other side of a door. Winter settled over Harlan's Crossing with its usual deliberate patience. The valley went first gray and then white. The oaks stood bare against a pewter sky, and the mornings were long and cold, and Margaret loved them in the way she had always loved them, the specific pleasure of necessary work in cold air, the reward of the stable's warmth after the walk across the frozen yard. The kicking had stopped the night the wall came down. The task had been completed and so the signal had ceased, with a logic so clean it made Margaret feel, in retrospect, a little slow. Rue had needed her to do a thing. The thing was done. They could all move on. That was the quality she came to admire most in the mare, the absence of grudge. No lingering resentment for 4 weeks of being called a problem. No seeking of credit. just a steady and equable presence that seemed to carry no weight of the past at all, or if it did, carried it so well you couldn't see the strain. She thought, that winter, a great deal about what it meant to be heard. Not the surface version, where someone turns their head and meets your eyes and makes the appropriate sounds. The deeper version, the kind that required you to be wrong about something first. The kind that asked you to sit with uncertainty long enough that you stopped trying to resolve it with the tools you already had. She had spent her whole life being reasonably good at the surface version. The deeper version had required more from her than she had always been willing to give. It had required her to stop deciding in advance what something meant and let meaning arrive in its own time. Daniel had known how to do that. She was sure of it now. He had been able to sit with unresolved things, with questions that didn't yet have answers, with people in situations that were still becoming themselves, and wait without impatience for what they would show him. She had loved that quality and, she now admitted, sometimes found it quietly frustrating, because she had always been more inclined toward resolution, toward deciding, toward making sense of things quickly enough to get on with whatever came next. Rue had not allowed her to get on with it. That was the gift, underneath everything else. The mare had simply refused to be dismissed. She had continued her clear and patient signal when every human in the radius had agreed it was nonsense, not because she didn't notice the dismissal, but because what she was communicating about was more important than the discomfort of being misread. Margaret turned that thought over in the long evenings of January, sitting by the wood stove with Ember in her lap and ash curled on the arm of Daniel's old chair, the fire going, the valley outside deep in snow. She wrote a letter to her son in early February, the 2-year anniversary of his father's death. She didn't mention the anniversary. She just wrote, something she hadn't done in longer than she could comfortably admit. She told him about Rue, about the kittens, about what she had thought sitting on a stable floor in October, holding a lantern over a gap in a wall. She sealed the letter and walked it to the post box herself in the cold morning air. Her son called a week later and talked for an hour and a half, longer than they had talked in years. He asked about the horses and the cats and whether she had enough wood for the rest of the winter. He asked how she was, in the way people ask when a letter has made them realize they hadn't been asking carefully enough. Margaret answered honestly, which was a different thing from answering well. She said she had had a strange and surprising autumn. She said she was all right. She meant it. Spring came the way it always does in the valley, first as a rumor in the air, a slight softening of the light, a degree or two of warmth that hadn't been there the week before. Then the snow retreated from the south-facing slopes, and the grass came back beneath it, winter flattened at first but thickening quickly with a vitality that always surprised Margaret no matter how many springs she had witnessed. The oaks put out their first tentative leaves, small and almost translucent, and the birds returned with their noise, and the mornings changed in that particular way spring mornings change, from something you endure to something you want to be present for. She walked Rue out to the pasture on a morning in late March. A proper walk on the lead rope, across the yard and through the gate. The ground was soft beneath them and the air had the particular quality of new things beginning. At the gate Margaret unclipped the rope and the mare stood still for a moment with her head raised and the breeze moving through her mane. Then she walked forward into the field and dropped her head and began to graze, without drama or announcement, with the simple and complete pleasure of an animal doing exactly what it was built to do in exactly the right conditions. Margaret leaned on the gate and watched her. She thought about nothing in particular. She was aware of the field, and the mare, and the light on the hills beginning to wane toward its late afternoon color. She was aware of the stable behind her and the cats somewhere inside the house and the fact that it was a Tuesday in March and she had no obligations for the afternoon. She breathed. She watched the horse. She let the moment be large enough to hold her without trying to make it mean more than it was. She thought, once, briefly, that she should tell Daniel about Rue. And then she allowed herself the gentler version of that thought, which was that maybe he already knew. Not in a mystical sense, but in the sense that the things you love about someone continue in the world after they are gone, lodged in the habits and ways of seeing they gave to the people who loved them. Daniel had taught her, over 40 years, to look more carefully than she was inclined to wait longer than was comfortable, to sit with what she didn't understand until it became clear. She had not always listened, but she was listening now. The afternoon held them all. Rue in the field with her head down. Ember on the kitchen windowsill, a small orange shape visible from across the yard. Ash on the bed upstairs where he had established squatters' rights and defended them with complete indifference to any outside opinion. The stable at her back, old and weathered and full of all the mornings it had held. And the valley going on around her in its own unhurried way, the oaks and the road and the green ground and the hills beyond, all of it so familiar it had long become a kind of language she had been speaking her whole life without fully knowing it. She stayed until the sun moved behind the western ridge and the temperature dropped and the light thinned toward evening. Then she called Ruin from the field, and the mare came without urgency, pausing once to look back at the pasture the way you look back at a place you know you're returning to, and they walked back to the stable together in the cooling air. There are times in a life when you understand something you have known for a long time but not known fully. Not a revelation in the loud sense. Not a flood of sudden light. Just a settling, like a key turning in a lock that has been stiff for years, and the door opening quietly onto something that was always there. Margaret did not think she had changed exactly in the months since October. She thought she had become more clearly herself. A subtraction of things that accumulate when you stop paying close attention. The small certainties. The practiced assumptions that you have already learned what there is to learn. She had not already learned it. She was still learning. Rue went into her stall. Margaret forked up the old bedding, spread fresh hay, checked the water, and did all the small rightful tasks of evening. The other horses were fed and settled. The stable grew quiet around her, the specific quiet of satisfied animals, warm and full, the low remaining light coming through the high windows, and the smell of it all, which was the smell of her whole life, of childhood and marriage and seasons stacked carefully one upon another, of work done faithfully in the particular piece that faithfulness earns. She closed the stable door behind her and walked back across the yard in the dark. The kitchen was lit and warm. Ember wound around her ankles before she had even taken her coat off. Ash was on the bed upstairs, exactly where she had known he would be. She made supper and ate at the table and didn't put the television on. Tonight she wanted the sounds of the house itself. The radiator ticking. The cats moving in the other room. The faint sound of wind picking up outside. The sound of a life being lived in its own quiet key. Some things knock on a wall for a long time before anyone hears them. Some things call out in languages we haven't learned yet and wait, with a patience that seems impossible from the outside but makes complete sense from within. Some lives are changed by grand events, by sudden illumination, by the dramatic reversal that everyone around you can plainly see. And some lives are changed in October, in a stable, in the dark, by an animal who simply refused to stop. Margaret washed her dishes. She let Ember climb on her shoulder while she did it, which she did not usually allow but had stopped enforcing. She turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, and then she slept, and it was a good sleep. The kind that comes when the day has been actually used, when you have been present in it, when you can account for where you were and what you did and find that it was enough. It was more than enough. And somewhere across the yard, in the stall at the end of the stable, Rue stood in the warm dark and breathed her slow and even breaths, and whatever it is that a horse carries in its long patient heart, she carried it steadily through the night. If this story stayed with you, you can leave a like or write something in the comments below. Stories like this one are kept alive by the people who find them worth holding on to. And if you'd like to return to this kind of quiet, to more stories told slowly and without hurry, you're welcome to subscribe. We'll be here, the same as always, waiting.